This is Contra,
where we go back and forth about film.
I'm Dakota Arsenault.
And I'm Rachel Ho. Today we're going to be talking about COVID-related movies, specifically movies that are either made directly about COVID or those that are set in the time of the COVID-19 lockdown. We're going to go over a few different movies, and Dakota and I will discuss what it is that we think as audience members makes a good COVID movie, essentially. How to avoid becoming gimmicky, considered opportunistic, and ultimately distasteful. And I just want to clarify, this is obviously a very subjective topic, and this is just what Dakota and I, our personal opinions are. Your tolerance might be much higher, much lower, or somewhere in between. But just keep that in mind as we go through this discussion. And Dakota and I will also be talking about the future of film post-COVID as the world gets a little bit better, as the pandemic hopefully winds down. We're going to be seeing more films, and so we want to have a little discussion about how filmmakers will change their way of storytelling and how they're going to go forward in terms of talking about COVID, if they will at all. So this is a topic that I've been pretty interested in since I saw a British movie called Host, which we'll get into. But Dakota, how about you? Has this been a topic that you've been interested in, or is just something that hasn't really been on your radar?
Yeah, it has a little bit. Earlier last year, right after the pandemic had started, I did an episode kind of talking about what me and my guest Royce were sort of watching and catching up on, and sort of how we were sort of spending our time pandemic-wise. And I guess it was only really a matter of time before movies started coming out. I'll feel like I'm going to share a bit more feelings about this later on as we discuss some more different things, but it sort of seems now where when a event would happen, whether it's a localized event or a global event, there'd be 10, 15 years and then a movie would be made looking back on the experiences and how everything was shaped afterwards and what was the same and what was different. But it seems to be a bit more of a recent trend in the last 10 or so years where a big event will happen and then almost immediately a movie is put in production. And so I wasn't really thinking about COVID set movies when COVID started. I don't think anyone was. I think everyone was really just more thinking about surviving and what the hell is going on in the world. But it really should be of no shock that there was very quickly going to be movies made about this pandemic. I know early on, there were stories about movies and TV shows trying to get back into production. And so the first big high profile movie was Malcolm and Marie.
Right.
And of course that has nothing to do with COVID. It was just shot during this time where they used only 2 actors for the entire film and a very limited crew. And I remember when news of this broke out and the entire list of COVID safety protocols that in order for the movie to be allowed to be filmed, they had to follow this very strict set of rules. And you're reading, and we're like, wow, that's crazy, all the things that they have to do. And then sure enough, more and more stuff started picking up. And we're now basically watching stuff on TV that was filmed during the pandemic, because TV has a pretty quick turnaround. So it's not a surprise at all. And, if you watch, I watch Top Chef, and it's interesting, anytime they basically leave their studio, they have to be wearing masks. And so it's that sort of stark reminder of when this was filmed, sort of time stamps it a little bit. So it shouldn't surprise me at all that there was COVID set movies set into production pretty quickly. I think what's most interesting is, as we're going to kind of talk about, the different genres and the different mediums they use to sort of illustrate what was going on. And that's what's most interesting to me right now.
100%. Yeah, I think it's, we've had, at minimum, I think people had 6 months of just not going out and not doing anything. And so for a lot of creative people out there in Hollywood, in music as well, and in TV, and I think in all forms of art, there's been a real shift of kind of a spurt of creativity, I guess you could call it, and different ways of showing your whatever, showing whatever it is that you're creating. And so we've had movies that were before COVID. So the computer screen movies, the John Cho Searching. There was a movie called Profile that came out a couple years ago, but it just got released in North America, which is just set entirely on a computer desktop. And so it was things like that I feel like we're going to see a bit more of. I know you watched a documentary, Disintegration Loops, I think was that what it's called? Yeah. And that was done almost entirely through Zoom. And so I think we are going to see a bit more of that, hopefully in a way that's good. And we talked about this actually in Hot Docs, I believe, when we were talking about the one of the documentaries where they didn't have it finished, and then the back half of it was on Zoom. And I remember you saying that you found it a bit like not jarring, but it's like you noticed that all of a sudden they moved to Zoom, and we know why, and it's very time stamping, and that actually moves really nicely to the first movie, called Host.
Hi, Teddy.
Let's do a shot after us.
Okay, everyone get in. 3, 2, 1. Have you ever done anything like this before?
I've never done this over Zoom. Obviously, we're not physically together, but there's no reason why Spirit can't communicate over the internet.
Nothing's going to happen.
Visualize us sitting in a circle. Spirit, we invite you to use us to pass on any communication. Is there anyone there? Please come forward.
I know you haven't seen it, but it's like a small British film that was released pretty early on, actually, in COVID. Now, like relatively speaking, early. So it came out on Shudder, which is a horror streaming service, on July 30th, and they talk about how basically within 12 weeks, it's like the conception of the idea and then its release on Shudder. It was all done within 12 weeks. Like, it was a very, very quick turnaround. This movie is shot entirely over Zoom. It's just a group of girls, like a group of girlfriends who are in lockdown in London, who've decided that they want to do like a seance, and they hire somebody who comes in and does like an online seance, and then kind of horror antics ensue. It's a very, very good movie. I really enjoy it. I think if you like horror movies, it's definitely one to check out. It's a pretty short film too. I think it's just under an hour. And the interesting thing here is that it's not about COVID. It's not a movie that it's about COVID, but there are definitely references to COVID. Like, one of the girls will cough, and then the other girls will be like, "Ooh, like, do you have it? Like, maybe she's infected." So those types of things will definitely date the movie. But one thing I thought was interesting, and you talked about that just previously in terms of the mode and the medium that movies are being shot, is that all the effects in it, because there is like a supernatural aspect to it. So there's things like flying in the background and objects moving. The entire cast had to set those things up themselves. They had to do their own lighting setups. They had to do their own makeup, hair, like all of that kind of stuff. They did it on their own, which I thought was just really interesting. And seeing this really tiny movie, and because there were no movies that had new movies that came out at that time. So I thought Host was just this wonderful, almost capsule of a time without, like, kind of what I said at the very beginning in the intro, without being gimmicky. So I know you haven't seen it, but I'm assuming you've heard of Host, and you kind of know the deal behind it.
Yeah, it is interesting. I had first heard of it when the Letterboxd podcast did an interview with I believe it was like the director and someone else involved on the team. And so it was very interesting because, while it was filmed through Zoom, it also kind of wasn't, because they would set up cameras next to their laptops. Yeah. And then so they would basically have Zoom running. So that way they could be in contact with the other cast members and crew members who were silently watching but not pictured on screen. And then using like actual film cameras set up to make sure you got like the higher quality images. Obviously, with some of the stuff they did, I believe they did use actual Zoom footage to give that sort of grainy look, but also I think they added a little bit in post-production so that way they would match the feeling. But yeah, that stuff always fascinates me. It really, the story of how they made that really sort of reminds me a bit of like DIY theater, where sort of everyone is involved with doing what they need to bring the project to life. So the idea of using people you live with to help do some of the practical effects, or what was done practically and what was done in post and things like that, was all very interesting to me, and how it was all basically sourced from what they already owned and all that great stuff. So it's very interesting to sort of hear about the creation of it and read a bit about it afterwards. I'm not a huge horror person, especially when there's things like ghosts involved in jump scares and stuff like that. That's really not my forte. I watched the trailer. I'm like, yeah, I'm glad I didn't watch it. Like, some of the stuff definitely looks a little silly, but then, like, you know, seeing the flower footsteps, like that would just kind of like make me not sleep.
There were actually some, in terms of jump scares, like there were some pretty big ones, I have to say. And like, without spoiling the movie too, is they use like some features of Zoom, which I thought it was in a very, very clever way. Like, you know how you can kind of record a background for yourself? Like so they use that. And it kind of looks like this weird time loop of the character moving around in the background, but then like other things are going on at the same time. It's a very interesting movie. And for anybody, like I said, anyone who's into horror movies or you're just curious about it, it's like 56 minutes long. I think like an episode of like a Marvel TV show is about the same thing. So I think you can watch it. It's on Shudder still, I believe. But it's a great movie. And it's one of those that I personally I felt like it hit that balance of being a movie that it did reference COVID and it's clearly set in the time of COVID, but it doesn't use it as a prop. It doesn't use it as a crutch. Like, it's nothing that, I guess it kind of needed to be set in COVID in order for it to have been created, but the story itself is very captivating. It's very interesting. And yeah, there's some pretty cool horror tropes in it that, you know, I personally enjoyed them. I like horror movies, so it's like, it's pretty cool. But then, another movie that was set during COVID or during a pandemic, actually, this one's it's a little bit different. He never actually mentions what the pandemic is or what it's called, but it's a movie called In the Earth by Ben Wheatley.
He told me his story. These are his memories. Can you feel him now? In the earth?
No, I don't know what you mean.
I think you do.
So what are you working on?
Researching ways of making crops more efficient.
Funny place to study crops in a forest.
We had to send a rescue party in to get a group out a couple of months ago. They got lost.
Why didn't they use GPRS?
There's no phone reception in there. People get a bit funny in the woods sometimes.
You saw this very recently. It premiered at Sundance earlier this year. And this was a movie that Wheatley created during COVID. He wrote it and he kind of got all the production developments in. It's a bit of a difficult one to describe what it's about. I know when you asked me what it's about, I didn't quite know how to describe it. It's, you know, you have two people who are in the middle of a pandemic and they need to go and make an equipment run into this forest. And this forest happens to be, I don't like to say enchanted, but that's kind of the best word to use to describe it. It makes it sound really silly, but like that's kind
very Disney-like.
Yeah, I know. It's an enchanted forest, but you know, they go in and there's somebody there who evaded quarantine, basically, who has evaded all of the lockdown measures and is living off of the earth, in the earth. There's no pun intended, but he's living off the earth and kind of chaos ensues from there. It's a very kind of psychedelic, aesthetic to it. When this movie was first released, the marketing was really behind it's a pandemic or like it's a COVID thriller. It's a COVID horror movie. You know, they kept saying Ben Wheatley's pandemic thriller. When you watched it, what sense did you get from this movie in terms of COVID or just a pandemic in general?
That's a good question, because I think as far as, you know, what you're talking about with hosts, as far as using the pandemic as an aid to the storytelling and not necessarily as a crutch or something that's overused, I actually think the movie does a pretty good job with that. You know, this is not going to be the first global pandemic film. You know, there's dozens of movies like this, whether you're talking about stuff like the 28 Days and Weeks Later movies, or Contagion, or I'm sure I'm blanking on other ones right now, but like that's clearly a bit of a subgenre of usually horror-ish films of the world is ravaged by a massive pandemic. And so I think they do a pretty good job setting that up. And more often than not in those types of films, they usually don't say what was the cause. It'll be like, oh, there was a virus that swept the earth. And that's kind of all they say, because then you risk, you know, getting too much into the science mumbo jumbo and how realistic is it and all this sort of stuff. But in this case, you know, when they're like, oh yeah, and something is spreading across the earth, everything is kind of in lockdown. This, you know, they get to this like park ranger outpost building, and they have to be sprayed with a decontamination spray in order to get in, and they get a little bit of blood work done. We know what all that means, and they do the nose swab and all that sort of stuff. We understand what that means in relation to COVID because we either ourselves or know people who did it, or we have seen it on the news, stuff like that. All that sort of stuff is very intimately familiar by this point. But the fact that they don't call it COVID, they don't say any specific pandemic, they don't any of the science behind what COVID is, they don't really reference any of that, other than the fact that you kind of need to be sanitized down, and they're gonna check a nose swab, which means that clearly it's an airborne disease sort of thing. So they have the hallmarks there, and I think they do a pretty good job of setting up what it is. And then, you know, there's a couple moments when they get into the forest and they first meet this, I guess we'll call him a homeless character, Zach, who, you know, one of the first things he says is like, do you mind if I keep my distance? Which is, you know, he understands that these are two people who, the fact that they probably are doing this, you know, job, that they passed their medical tests and stuff like that. And he's presumably been living alone in a forest for the long period of time, that he also has not come in contact with anyone. But it's still just sort of very much of a hallmark where right now, like, you know, I've seen some people who have had their vaccine and stuff like that, and I'm about to get my shot, and it's still very much we're like, you know, I'm not going to high five you, I'm not going to handshake you, I'm not going to give you a hug, I'm just going to be like, you know, nod in your direction, be like, yeah, it is nice to see you, sort of thing. So I totally get that feeling. Obviously, what the actual movie turns into has very little to do with an actual pandemic or anything like that, and you know, it seems to just be a setting up premise, which if you were saying that they were heavily marketing this as Ben Wheatley's pandemic film, which from what I kind of remember when it was coming out at Sundance, I was hearing that too, makes absolutely no sense, because it's barely, like, I think the only reason why it works as a plot device is to give a reason why there are so few people in the movie. If that makes sense.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a really, really good point. I thought, I'll admit, like, so when I went in to watch In the Earth, because of all the marketing behind it, I was already pretty turned off by it, which isn't fair to the movie. Like, you shouldn't prejudge it in that way, but we always go into a movie with different expectations or our own biases or whatever. But I went in being a little annoyed. I was like, seriously? Like, I really like Ben Wheatley. I'm a big fan of a lot of his movies. And so I was like, come on, Wheatley, like, what are you doing? I was like, why are you doing this? Like, why are you making this movie? And it's a pandemic thriller, blah, 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 blah. Like, I was like, in my head, I go, this is beneath you, Ben. Like, come on. I don't know him. I don't know the man, but I was like, this is beneath you. But then I watched the movie and I was like, oh, this is not really about COVID at all. It's not even about a pandemic, really. Like you said, that's an interesting point you say. Like, it gives a good reason as to why there were just not very many characters. There are not many people in the background, even. Like, we don't see that many people. I didn't think about that, but I find these kinds of movies, it's like when we watch it, if you know, for generations that will come after COVID, who didn't have to live through this, I think they'll watch it maybe with a very different lens, you know, when we watch old movies, like, we watch it from a very different lens. But I think that because we're living through this, so even if he doesn't mention COVID, we kind of imprint that onto the movie anyways. And we've done that with movies like Contagion, which came out years before COVID was even a thing. And so now when we look back on it, like, we can't help but find, direct correlations to it, which is also a really interesting, kind of concept of, is it just us? Like, is it not necessarily filmmakers who are taking advantage of a situation and trying to manipulate audiences? Is it just us kind of imparting our own experiences onto these movies?
Yeah, well, that's almost sort of like the concept behind, like, the author doesn't really get to say what their art is actually about. Once it's released to the masses, the public decides what is the actual meaning behind the art, where, whether it's a movie, a song, or a painting or whatever, the artist can be like, no, it's just this. Whereas everyone else goes, well, it's actually not really, because, the technique that you're using and what you're trying to say and, social context and all this sort of stuff adds so much more layers to it. And suddenly, what should be just a simple project, piece of art, suddenly has so much more meaning behind it. It's interesting. I almost feel like In the Earth feels a bit like the movie Annihilation. I don't know if you saw that Natalie Portman film or not. But, a plot point in the Earth is that these two main people are trying to find basically a remote science laboratory where the scientist has kind of cut off contact. And that's sort of similar to Annihilation, where they have to send in a group of people into, this unknown space in order to gather research to find out what's happening with the other people that have previously gone in. And, you can even compare it to like Tarkovsky's Stalker or something like that, where, that's also not really a new story idea of this idea of a mysterious land that needs to be investigated because people are going missing, or there's some secret power behind it, or all this sort of stuff. So I feel like Wheatley's really drawing on some of those themes in order to get his work. Now, it's interesting. You actually interviewed him for Exclaim. Did he share sort of any of his thoughts on how this film is sort of being called, the COVID horror film or COVID film or whatever it's being marketed as?
I actually skirted that issue with him because I didn't know if this was going to be something that he wanted to talk about. But he was very, like, when I talked to him, I did ask him about COVID related questions, but not necessarily about how his movie was being interpreted. But he gave some really interesting answers of, how can a filmmaker at this point not have COVID, something related to COVID, affect your work? Because this is this is quite an experience in that. I mean, hopefully this is a one-time thing for us. But it's very difficult for us to come out of this and be the same people that we were before this. There is going to be a before and an after, and we've changed as people. And I think we've changed as a society as well of, like you said, like, oh, do we shake hands? Do we hug? Like, even something like that, just, we don't really understand quite yet what the effects are going to be socially. And that was Wheatley's kind of point, was everything is different now. Everything has changed now. So when you do a movie, it would be, and in his words, he said, it would be weird to ignore it. It would be weird to be something that you don't address at some point in your movie, especially for contemporary movies, which In the Earth is, I think I would consider it contemporary. Would you think it's contemporary?
Yeah, I feel like it's contemporary in the sense of, they have cell phones, they have, fancy audio gear that they use and scientific equipment, stuff like that. But it also sort of seems like contemporary adjacent, where it's not clearly happening during COVID, but it's clearly happening during something like COVID. So yeah, you could call it contemporary, I guess, in that sense.
Yeah, and I like that. I like that he said that. Like, it did make me think a bit, because like I said before, I was very on side of, I don't think we should be using COVID yet. Like, I think it's too soon. I think that, this is something that's really affecting people. Like, people have lost loved ones. People have lost jobs. People have lost their homes. Like, it's really turned the world into a very odd place all of a sudden. And it's to me, for filmmakers to try to capitalize on it, it feels really gross to me. But then when he said to me, like, it would be weird to ignore it in a contemporary movie. And I thought, that's actually very true. Like, it would be very strange for not just movies, like TV shows that were in production before. So like shows that, I don't know, I think of like, is ER still on? I think ER is still on. Or like Grey's Anatomy, like those kind of hospital dramas. Like, how can they carry on as if nothing happened? You can't, because this is something so, so large and so vast that we really can't ignore it. And so when Wheatley said that really made me think, and it really turned my mind, like a little kind of behind the scenes there was, I had written a review for Exclaim as well about In the Earth, and I sent the draft in, and I was a bit, not harsh, but there were a couple lines in there that I wasn't, I expressed that I wasn't very happy about how they were promoting the movie as being this COVID thing. But then after I talked to Wheatley, my mind completely changed on it. And I thought, like, it's not using the situation to his advantage. It's literally like, you can't ignore it. And I found that to be a very fascinating bit to him as like a creative person. Yeah.
And I guess that makes complete sense. And I guess if we want to actually like sort of talk about the movie, for me, in the end, it didn't really work for me. I really appreciate the kind of craziness that it eventually went to with the sort of psychedelic music and imagery. It was very, very interesting. And, we watched a great documentary about folk horror earlier this year. And it's obviously following in that footsteps. I almost feel like it was like taking basically every main, I hate using the word trope because trope has a negative connotation, but to put it positively, basically every trope from the folk horror canon and sort of make it into a film. Like, we were watching that documentary and there's so many movies I'd never heard of. And once you start talking about the different cultures and the different time periods that they're inhabiting, I definitely noticed a lot of those themes popping up in the Earth that Wheatley was also trying to work with himself and use that as sort of the framework for the film. And so it was interesting watching that documentary, Woodlands Dark and Days Bewitched, I believe is what it's called. Excellent film. And when it comes out, I hope people will watch it. But it often seemed like he was just sort of like taking those themes and just kind of putting them into the movie and not really doing anything with them. I didn't feel really any sort of emotional connection within the Earth by the end of it. Like, I didn't really care what was happening to any of the main characters.
Yeah, I'd agree with that, actually. Yeah, I didn't have any investment in them. Not that I cared if, like, sounds a bit harsh to say, like, I don't care if they lived or died. But I truly didn't. Like, I was just kind of like, oh, it's like, it's just a story. And I thought, it's interesting. I like I said this to you before, I thought the movie for me was it's just fine. Like, it's fine. It's not, I wouldn't consider it a bad movie. I wouldn't say it's a particularly great movie though. It's fine. It's there, I think
it's just kind of boring, which is almost like, I kind of regard that as like the cardinal sin of movie making is don't be boring. And like, there was some pretty graphic violence that like really made me kind of turn away, especially with the main character's foot. There's a few really bad scenes where you're just like, whoa, okay, that's a little too much for me right now. But other than that, there just wasn't a ton really that I was, I was trying to reach out and connect to something, and I was just like, I don't really care in the end.
Yeah.
Great, they lived. Oh, they died. Oh, great. Who cares either way?
Yeah. I think when a movie kind of comes through and then you don't necessarily care too much about the ending of the movie, something's wrong. Something didn't quite click. But I don't know. I think it's going to be one of those movies. Like I've heard it described as like a micro budget horror movie where it's just kind of one of those things that was made, it was incepted and it was made during COVID, and it's very much so a product of its time. And I don't know. I think it's a fine movie. I think for people who like big Ben Wheatley fans, maybe it's something to check out, but otherwise, I don't know. It's probably other movies that you can watch. Other movies like, great transition, Borat Subsequent Moviefilm, which I completely forgot had COVID-related material to it. until you brought it up. And I was like, oh yeah. It's like not just a little bit, like they have a whole song that, am I correct that song didn't get nominated for an Academy Award? It got nominated for something though, I feel like.
Obama was a traitor. America, he hated. He belonged inside the jails. I ain't lying, it ain't no jokes. Corona is a liberal hoax. Corona is a liberal hoax. Obama, what we gotta do? Inject him with the Wuhan flu. Inject him with the Wuhan flu. Let's hear it.
No, it was shortlisted.
It was shortlisted,
but it did not crack the final 5 nominees.
So do you want to talk about Borat a little bit?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, that was interesting because I don't think Sacha Baron Cohen was planning to make a Borat film specifically about COVID. I think either way it was in production, and I know his reasoning to bring back the Borat character after more than a decade off of the big screen was, what was at first, sort of peeling the thin veneer off of America's "we're not racist" facade, where it clearly showed, large swaths of the country are deeply troubled and racist people with abhorrent views. In the decade since, that there was no thin veneer covering them. They was all completely out in the open, especially when you had a president who was leading the charge, and they were all devout followers of him and repeating the same rhetoric and all that sort of stuff. And so it went from like a wink and a nod, this is what we really mean, to no, we're going to say it straight to your face. And so I know that's why Cohen wanted to bring the character back. And right as they were about to do it, that's when sort of COVID hit as well. And it almost worked too perfectly for his narrative. Like a lot of the stuff that Cohen does, you look at it and you're like, if you would have scripted this, if this was a scripted narrative program, I would not believe it, because he's just so adept at coming up with scenarios and concepts and having the people that he, I don't want to say ambushes, but, uses in his scenes basically fall hook, line, and sinker for his almost reassuring comfort of that he's on the same page as them. And when they started incorporating some of the COVID scenes, it was just very interesting. So, he ends up staying with these two gentlemen who tell him that, COVID is a hoax created by Hillary Clinton, and they don't like wearing masks, but sometimes you have to, and you can just, spray disinfectant and it'll go away, sort of thing. And from there, it kind of keeps going, all the way up to the very end when the epilogue, where it's revealed that Borat gave Tom Hanks COVID, which was, a funny little wink and a nod sort of thing of how COVID, really gained mainstream understanding. It really wasn't until Tom Hanks and his wife Rita Wilson got COVID when they were filming out in Australia, and after that was like right when like the avalanche sort of started of people really understanding what was happening. So yeah, it was just interesting to kind of to think back of that movie and how the purpose of it was basically a response to Trumpism, and the out in the open, racism, hatred of basically everyone that isn't in their in-group, morphed into a film about COVID and how science has become a political issue, a left versus right issue, and all that sort of stuff, where like, it's like, just shut up and put on a mask and try not to go out so much. Like, calm down. Like, all these people that say, oh yeah, it'll be gone soon. It really would have been gone sooner if people had actually listened to that advice.
It's incredible. Like, thinking back on it, it is incredible how much resistance there was and continues to be against the idea of putting a mask on. And like you said, don't go out as much as you used to go out. And I saw somebody put online the other day, like, this is a bit of a tangent, but they said like, everyone who says lockdowns don't work. Like, people, like, there's a whole bunch of people that are like, lockdowns don't work. The reason they don't think lockdowns work is because we haven't actually done a lockdown. Like, we haven't actually been in a proper lockdown. Like, I have a family member who lives over in Singapore, and they had a proper lockdown. Anybody familiar with Singapore is they're quite a strict country, and they're very rule abiding as well. And so they actually, they had a proper lockdown, and their mandate of wearing a mask, it was the second you step outside of your door, you have to put a mask on. There wasn't any of like, oh, if you're indoors, if you're out, like whatever, if you're around people, put it on. It was once you're outside, doesn't matter if you're all by yourself, put a mask on. And their numbers have been very, very low for pretty much the whole time. Like, it's not like they spiked at any point. Like, their spike is maybe like I don't know, 20 people or something like that. And it's not to make a flippant, because I know people have passed away and they did have problems with the foreign workers, but you know, it is interesting when you see a movie like Borat, where, and I guess that's the appeal of Borat, is that you see like real people. These aren't actors. These are people who are, this is genuinely what they believe in, and genuinely how they have viewed not only Donald Trump or, you know, the last 4 years in America, but how they viewed COVID as, like you said, this weird conspiracy theory that Hillary Clinton and Bill Gates and, you know, 5G and all that kind of stuff. And it's interesting to see that, like, it's real. Like, you know, sometimes we just watch it on through the news or whatever, and you kind of think, people don't really think that way. And not to say that Borat was meant to be like a serious documentary or anything like that, but he had Sacha Baron Cohen has a very like unique way about him that gets people to open up and really reveal who they are. And he does ambush. Like, I agree with the word ambush, but he does it in a way that it doesn't seem confrontational. Like, not in like a Michael Moore way, for example. Like, it's a very different way. And he doesn't even do it as like a comedic way. Like, I'll admit, I'm not a huge fan of, I like Sacha Baron Cohen, but like his characters, I'm not a big fan of. When it's just him being an actor, I think he's phenomenal. But when he does like Ali G and Borat, which I understand he is acting as well. For some reason, I've never been that taken with those, kind of characters that he's done. But I gained quite a new appreciation for him, for Borat, because I know that a lot of work went into, you know, getting these people to open up and also hiding his own identity. Because now that people know who Borat is, that was the other thing too, because people have to know who he is, right? So did they know like that this is for a movie? Is this for like comedy? But you know, they all agreed to be in it, so I'm not sure. Borat is an interesting because it's kind of mockumentary style, and again, it's similar to In the Earth, is it doesn't focus too much on COVID. Like you said, the premise of the second Borat movie was not meant to be about a virus. It was meant to be about the upcoming election, federal election in the United States at the time. That's what the original kind of idea was for him. So him adding in the COVID stuff, I mean, Borat's one of those things that it isn't meant to be, I shouldn't say it's not meant to be taken seriously, because I think that he actually ends up showing like a real side of America that people might not think is real. And so I think Borat, it does a really interesting job of highlighting COVID and being a bit of a capsule of the virus at that time. And that's pretty different in the way that In the Earth is, which is not meant to be a capsule. It's just a movie that happens to be set during a pandemic, and it happened to be made during a pandemic. So you can draw your own conclusions there. So now if we turn our attention over to a couple movies that are actually about COVID-19 specifically, we can start with a movie called Songbird.
Curfew is now in effect. All unauthorized citizens must stay indoors.
Tensions rise as we enter the 213th week of lockdown.
A grim new reality emerges.
COVID-23 has mutated.
Beginning thermal scan. Thermal scan normal.
A horrifying new development
new
today.
Data confirms the virus attacks the brain tissue.
Hey,
whoa! I'm immune! I'm immune!
Worldwide death toll rises to over 110 million.
All infected Americans are being forced into quarantine camps.
Which I know you haven't seen, Dakota. You know about it though, right?
I do, yes.
Okay, so it was released mid-December. And the reason I give the release date is just because I think it's important to understand like what the world was looking like when this movie came out. So it was released in mid-December, and it's by a director named Adam Mason, and it's produced by Jerry Bruckheimer. That's what Jerry Bruckheimer's name is kind of what got people's attention on it. It's an apocalyptic thriller. It's set in 2024. And there's now something called COVID-24. So every single year, COVID has mutated into a different strain, into something new, and it's become incredibly contagious. People are genuinely locked in their houses. There's a group called what they call munies, which are people who are immune to the disease. And yeah, I thought that was really weird. But they get a yellow bracelet that they wear to identify themselves as being a quote unquote muni. And there's something called a Q zone, which they send off people who have been infected or potentially infected. So if somebody in your household got it, your whole household will be sent to Q zone. And in Q zone, you're basically left to die. You're left to just, and that whole area has become a slum, and a lot of crime happens, like a lot of assaults, things like that. It's an interesting movie. They have some actually really big names in the film, like the Demi Moore is in it. Demi Moore is in it. Craig Robertson, Peter Stormare is in it. Alexandra Daddario is in it. So you've got some like name brand people. It's an interesting movie because they really focus on this idea of like every morning it's government mandated. So it's set in LA, and so the LA County, they require you to do a test, like a screening test on your phone. They scan you, and they have the technology in 2024 to detect your temperature, and whether or not you have a fever, and so on and so forth. And then obviously you kind of have this other storyline of illegal activities are being happened. Like people are selling fake yellow bracelets so that they can also be considered munies. And it's a completely desert-ridden LA at this point. Like everything has gone to hell because nobody has been out and about since 2019. This movie did not get received very well in the public, from audiences and from critics. This was one movie that everybody kind of looked at and said, this is incredibly gimmicky. This is incredibly opportunistic. And even if you take away COVID, it's not a great movie anyways. For my money, I think I watched it maybe about a month ago, and I can understand where people are coming from in terms of it being just not just a bit lacking in tact, because if we recall back in December, that was when COVID was pretty bad, actually, especially in the States. Things weren't going very well around wintertime. And so it did seem very kind of off the mark for a movie to be released that these variants were coming out. I say variants because that's what we've been calling the actual variants. They don't call it that in the movie. But this idea that the COVID is mutating and becoming something even stronger and even more deadly was not something I think people were ready to look at. And I think still, like if you released it today, I don't know how many people are going to be receptive to the idea of, oh, so in 2024, like we're still in this kind of thing. So Dakota, I know you haven't seen Songbird, but based off what I've said and based off things that I'm sure that you've read about it, what were your thoughts on that movie?
I watched the trailer, and I read the plot description on Wikipedia and read some reviews and remembering when it came out, that sort of stuff. Also, I think you had said Jerry Bruckheimer, but the name behind it is Michael Bay, which Michael Bay,
sorry.
That's all right. Michael Bay already doesn't have the best track record with the film industry anyways. That's usually a giant red flag for most people. But yeah, other than holy cow, is this plot incredibly convoluted when it's written out, it often, it sort of feels like it's Republicans' response to COVID. This concept of we're gonna, they're saying you have to stay at home. If you don't stay at home, they're gonna take you away to the quarantine camps where you're gonna be left to die and all that sort of stuff. And if you're not wearing a proper mask, they're gonna knock down your door and the police are going to get you, which is like, it really sounds like, a far right wing conspiracy theory. Every time you're like, no, please just put a mask on and like, try not to like go to parties if you can. And like, I get it. You got to go to the grocery store. You can pick up food. You can go to your pharmacy, your drugstore, that sort of stuff, pick up what you need. But like, you don't need to be, shopping for a brand new wardrobe or all this sort of stuff. Like, you just don't need it right now. Like, especially not with like Amazon at your fingertips and you can get literally anything you want within a day. Like, just chill out, please. Just, it's not because of you, it's because of everyone else. Like, just think about someone outside of your own vicinity for once, please. And this movie just basically sounds like, well, what if all that stuff was true?
Yeah. That's the interesting point of Songbird, is that they don't focus very much on the virus. It's not like Contagion, which I actually thought that that's what the movie was going to be more about. Like, I thought it was going to be similar to a Contagion where they're looking literally just at the virus and that it like runs rampant, I don't know, creates zombies or something like that. Like, that's what I kind of thought where the movie was going. But then when you watch it, and it's literally just about lockdown. It's literally just about the protocols and people breaking them and, should we have them and so on and so forth, and kind of feeding into this idea of, freedoms being taken away. It is kind of, in a sense, a very, very American thing. Like, this was the first American film that basically got released, like that had been created and filmed during COVID. It was the first one, whereas in contrast, Host was the first one to come out in England. So it's interesting to kind of see the mindset that people had at the time of, Host was, okay, let's just do something on Zoom. I mean, it was a lot earlier, to be fair, so there weren't too many lockdown measures at the time, or there were, but it wasn't kind of as ongoing. It wasn't as long as eventually it got to Songbird. But it's one that I can understand. I think that the criticisms towards it as being a fear-mongering film are very, very well deserved, in my opinion. I think that it is incredibly kind of distasteful and unserving of the people who have worked really hard to try to get us to a point that maybe we can open up again, whereas this is more looking at it as they're taking away your freedoms and blah, 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 and all that jazz, whatever. So I get where the controversy for Songbird is. I think that, I don't think the movie itself, like if you took COVID away, I don't know if it's as bad as people say it. I think that it was literally just a response of, people being really pissed off that it even existed in the first place.
Yeah. No, that's completely fair. I think at the end of the day, if your movie is bad, it doesn't matter what sort of framework it's trying to work under. If it's bad, it's bad.
100%. Yeah, 100%. So the next movie we're going to talk about, and the last movie we're going to talk about, which is one that we've both seen, it's called Lockdown.
Not only is everything not okay, nothing is okay.
Linda said she was planning to end our thing.
Nobody wants to live alone.
For 2 weeks, we are locked together here.
You think I'm so happy and normal?
No, I'd never accuse you of being happy and normal.
Because I'm not!
Shaky ground.
I've been furloughed. Now there is literally zero purpose to my life. I'm going to get provisions.
We need milk, bread.
Wait, how many asses have you got?
Piss off. So this is a Doug Liman movie, who did Edge of Tomorrow and a bunch of other things, but I just really like Edge of Tomorrow, so I always like to mention that he did that. And it has Chiwetel Ejiofor and Anne Hathaway. It's about a couple who break up just before lockdown. It's set in London, and because of lockdown, they haven't been able to move out. They haven't been able to kind of actually properly break up. Somewhere along the way, there's a bit of a heist, situation. Just somewhere along the way, it becomes a heist movie. But it's a movie that there's a lot of references to lockdown. It is about COVID. Like, they do discuss it, and they do touch on things like people losing their jobs, people having a different outlook on their lives. Like, what are you doing with your life? And there's a lot of that. There's a lot of, they even do a scene, which I thought was quite funny, which was like applauding and making a bunch of noise for the NHS at a certain time to say thank you to all the healthcare workers. What did you think of this movie? It's I wouldn't call it a romantic comedy, but it is much more lighthearted, I would say, than Songbird for sure.
Yeah, this is another one that I feel like was also kind of poorly marketed. It was marketed as a heist film, and you watch the trailer, that seems to be what the predominant focus is, about Hathaway and Ejiofor robbing these diamonds from, is it Harrods?
Harrods, yeah.
Yeah. So a big fancy department store over in England, kind of like a Holt Renfrew type of thing where rich people shop. But yeah, it ended up being so much more relationship based, and that made the movie kind of pretty slow at times. Like it really took forever to get to this heist aspect of it, which really was like the last half hour or so of a 2-hour movie. But I actually didn't mind it. It was very interesting because I remember when it came out, it was not very well received. And for a subject, we're going to kind of talk a bit more right after this idea of it's a little too soon. But it's interesting, like I didn't watch Borat right when it came out because they dropped it like the week before the US election. And I'm like, there's too much going on right now. I do not need this sort of anger and stress in my life of watching idiots be racist on a movie right now when literally that's what's happening in real life. I don't need to watch it in my entertainment. So it took me several months to actually sit down and watch it. And I'm glad I waited. And I think similarly for this one, where if this movie were to come out in maybe, 5-10 years or something like that, it probably would be a lot more better received, especially if they were able to kind of hone in and fix maybe some of the stuff that was a little superfluous or just didn't really add much to it, that they just needed to sort of pad the runtime a little bit. But I think overall, it did a really good job, an interesting job capturing the early time period of COVID. I'm going to be a little bit honest here. Like, I know we're all like, wear a mask and stuff like that. But for me, it sort of felt it wasn't really until about early to mid-April that it was like, no, you need to be wearing a mask at all times when you go out. Like those first couple of weeks when lockdown first started, I wasn't wearing a mask in a grocery store. Like there wasn't signs that you had to have one wearing when you go in. A lot of people were wearing them, but not everyone was. I think there was a lot of confusion going on at the time too, where it seemed like every science and regulatory body wasn't really sure what was happening, and the governments didn't really want to impose any official restrictions yet. So it was all kind of really up in the air at that point, especially up in Canada, where while it was infecting people, it wasn't infecting people at the rate that like we were seeing in China, in the United States, in other countries, in like Italy and Spain, where, they were talking about like, 300-400 dead bodies a day sort of thing. And they just couldn't keep up with, where to put these bodies. They had nowhere to store them. And they were just basically rotting out in the open sort of thing. And Canada, it's like, well, that's not really happening right now. So what's happening? We don't really understand. So it's just definitely interesting. There was moments in the film where like they're not wearing a mask, and like looking back, I'm like, how are they not wearing a mask? I'm just like, well, like that first couple of weeks we weren't really wearing, and not everyone was wearing masks, or like forgetting it when you leave the house. Like the amount of times I forgot my mask leaving the house because I walk my dog every day, and I leave my apartment door, go downstairs to my lobby, and go outside, and be like, oh shit, I was on the elevator without a mask on. Oh my god, I feel terrible. I hope no one saw me, sort of thing. But like, it was just little moments like that I really liked.
I thought it's funny you say that because they have the scene in the elevator when they're in Harrods, right towards the end. Mm-hmm. And I thought it was really funny that like when they're entering Harrods, they both put a mask on, but then when they got in the elevator, they took them off, even though there were other people in the elevator.
Yeah,
and I was like, what are they doing? And then part of me kind of thought, I wonder if they did that because this is still a movie. Like this is still a Hollywood movie, and you have Anne Hathaway and you have Chiwetel Ejiofor, and you want to see their faces. Like I wasn't sure if that's what was part of, because I was like, there's kind of some weird inconsistency with these masks. Like what? But then the way you say it, you're right. Like there were many moments of we didn't really know what the protocol was. And I kind of think we're kind of back in that spot. Not so much Canada, but I can see it in the States where, because things are opening back up and being relatively normal again, you know, when do you wear a mask? Like, do you have to wear a mask? Do you not have to wear a mask? We're kind of back to that. It's kind of a weird cyclical phase that we're back to. But I thought Lockdown, I would agree with you in that. I think it's a well done capsule of what exactly was going on during lockdown, especially in the early stages, like you said. You know, this idea of there was a lot, like, you know, this idea of community and togetherness that I feel like we've kind of lost a little bit as the time has gone by. But certainly early on, that was very strong. Like I know that people, you know, where I live, people were very, very patient with one another and very kind of caring towards one another and considerate. And that's kind of gone away, I think, a little bit, just because people are a bit tired now. But at the beginning, that was there. So the scenes where, you know, Chiwetel Ejiofor, his character, goes out into the streets and reads poetry. At the time, that's like, okay, you know, it's in the first lockdown. Sure, that's kind of cute and it's unique. It's like novel. But then imagine if some guy's doing that like every single week for a whole year. You probably get a bit annoyed with it. But I think it's interesting that you say, you know, in terms of timing of when you watched it, like when you watched Borat. I watched Lockdown when it first came out, and I wouldn't say I didn't like it, but I was just kind of like, yeah, all right, like I get it. Like, you know, there's the toilet paper joke and, you know, all those kinds of things. And you're just like, I don't know. Are we ready to laugh at this yet? Are we ready to kind of make light about all these things? Like, and then I watched it just last night, just to kind of refresh my memory about it. And I have a completely different view of it now. Now I'm just kind of like, yeah, it's all right. Like it's a movie that shows, you know, it's pretty realistic. Not the heist bit, but the rest of it is pretty realistic in terms of how relationships were. And thinking about a couple that happens to break up just before lockdown, like, that sucks, you know, like breaking up sucks hard enough, but then you have this thing where it's very difficult to find a new apartment. It's very difficult to move out all of a sudden. I found that to be like a pretty compelling storyline there, but this was one of those movies that I actually think they did strike a good balance of not being opportunistic about it, not making it a gimmick, but rather, you know, just telling the story of this is how it was at the time.
Mm-hmm. I feel like there's a bit of gimmickry to it, but I think they do it in a way that's respectful enough that it makes sense. Like, clearly, like, this is the type of movie that can only be made about sort of COVID, whether it's COVID specifically or pandemic in general, just the way all the beats kind of play itself out. Whereas In the Earth can, you know, I compared it to Annihilation, so it could be made at any time. And same as Host too. You know, if instead of it being everyone is quarantining in their house and they live near each other, well, what happens if one person lives in Canada and one person lives in the US and one person's over in Europe and one person's over in Asia and they do this Zoom seance? Like, it still works the exact same. You can still make those same constraints sort of thing. And then, you know, you can kind of compare it to Songbird, which is like taking everything way out of proportion and blowing it out of control and stuff like that, where it's still very COVID based, but it's like everyone's worst fears realized sort of thing. I feel like Lockdown does have some of those similar gimmicks, but they seem to at least treat it with respect. Like, I remember not long after the pandemic started, there was from mental health professionals and critics talking about how the rise of things that they're concerned about, whether it's, you know, people's anxiety or depression are going to be exacerbated, or on way more serious and darker notes, people that are either in abusive relationships or live with an abusive person, whether it's, you know, physical, mental, verbal, however be, that's all going to be worsened so much. Or people with, you know, addictions, that's going to be made way worse, which they actually kind of touch on this a little bit too. The idea of how to stay sober when you've basically completely lost your mind and can't do anything and you have nothing to kind of distract you from your sobriety sort of thing. And so I think they kind of do touch on that with this idea of a relationship that is falling apart. And the more you're spending the more time you're spending around someone that you no longer want to be spending time with, the worse it's going to get. The more you're going to resent them and dislike them, and all that sort of stuff is really sort of pushed to the forefront. And like on the flip side, you're hearing stories about people who met like in the last year who have been quarantined together are now ready to get married. It's either put an expiry date quicker on relationships, or people that are like, no, this is the person I want to be with forever. It's actively sped it up because, you've basically spent, 2-3 years worth of dating time together in 8 months because you're seeing each other literally every single day, sort of thing.
Yeah. And that's actually a really nice segue into, kind of the final part of this, which is discussing about where do we think movies are going to go in the future? What kind of stories do we think are going to be told? There are a ton to be told, whether it's talking about mental health, whether it's touching on relationships that started out of COVID, ended, strengthened, and those could be familial relationships, friendships, romantic relationships. And then obviously you got the horror stories. You could do, I suppose, like there is a heist movie, like there's a good heist movie that could be found in a COVID related thing. But as for you, as someone who obviously really enjoys movies and really likes going to the movies, what kind of if at all, what kind of stories are you interested in seeing that are related to COVID going forward in the future?
It's tough because I feel like this is going to kind of tie in with another point that I know you want to make. I really hate this idea of something's happened, let's rush it into production to make a movie out of it. I really don't like it. It seemed to really kind of start post 9/11. There was a couple movies in particular. There was, what was it? United 93. And then there was the World Trade Center and Remember Me and like a few of them. And they all kind of came within like a couple of years. And that was like, even then, like it was like a 2-year window. And even then I was kind of like, wow, this is like way too early to really be dramatizing that sort of stuff. And then since then, it just really sort of accelerated that process of like, right after Rob Ford died, a movie went into production about that. I don't know if it came out or if it was just like a TV movie or something like that, the one with Damian Lewis. And I'm just like, I have zero interest in that. Or the fact that there's like already several Trump movies in production. I'm like, this just does not interest me in the absolute slightest. Like, you need a bit of breathing room between when something happened, whether it's, it's upsetting or whatever it is, and let the public to kind of grapple with it and breathe from it and not be on the forefront of their mind in order to be able to revisit it. And I feel like there's now such a race. You have to be the first one to get this movie made. Otherwise, what's the point? When in reality, especially if it's something that's a bit of a muddy topic where, there is no one story, it's multiple stories, it's multiple perspectives, all this sort of stuff. You kind of need a bit of time to really sort of suss everything out in order to understand what the real story actually is. Like you talk about, I don't know, war films. Like that's kind of a good example. Like you kind of need a bit of breathing time to be able to understand what is the actual after effects. How did this affect people, whether the people directly involved or the world at large? How did it affect them? And you need that time in order to really gather with it. And with all of these films, because they were shot and released during the pandemic, we don't know what the end is. We don't, like, obviously there's never, if you want to get, pedantic, there is no end to anything. Everything is kind of a continuation, but you still need that sort of a bit of a closure and reflection period in order to tell a story. And so basically, if a movie is telling a story about COVID or the pandemic, as of right now, I frankly have almost zero interest in it. I don't know about you.
That's fair. No, I think that's completely fair. I think, so we're recording this. This is June 2021, and Canada is just like, we're just opening. And so I'm in Ontario. We're just going to start opening again this coming weekend. Dakota's in BC, and they're a bit more open, but like things aren't normal yet. Like we're not back to normal yet. And who knows if we ever will get back to normal like that. That's also an entire possibility that, there is no more reverting back to what things used to be, which I actually think is probably the case. Like, I don't think anybody thinks that, we're going to just go back all of a sudden to 2018, 2019 and things are going to be gung-ho again. I do think in terms of my willingness to see COVID movies, yeah, I'm kind of there and I'm not at the same time. Like, I think it just depends on how they're doing, like what they're doing it. So there was a Mark Duplass movie about him taking language lessons over Zoom because he thought during lockdown I'm going to learn Spanish and I'm going to, and then kind of a relationship develops and things like that. But I like that kind of a story. I go, yeah, that's sweet. And that's kind of creative. And I like that. Like, I think if I'm going to see a COVID movie, it has to be something a bit more positive. Like, I don't think I want to watch another Songbird. I don't want to see another thing where they go, look how bad this could possibly get. And, I think it's interesting to use COVID and, I said it earlier of what Ben Wheatley said, which was, we can't go back. Like, we are different. We are forever changed by this. And it would be weird to completely ignore this world as being COVID free because we can't ignore it. Not in a contemporary film anyways. We can't ignore it. And talking about things like 9/11 and, what that did was, that was incredibly, not just in the States, I think all around the world, because it really affected people. And actually in that same Ben Wheatley interview, he talked about 9/11. He said, if you look at the movies from the 90s, they're incredibly joyous and happy and very kind of, like 90s action movies, for example. They're insanely over the top. Like, they're incredibly over the top, but in like the best way possible. And there's a reason for that, because people were pretty happy then, like people were very, you look at movies like Can't Hardly Wait and like those rom-coms of that, of that era. It's like everyone was very optimistic. And then 9/11 happened, and that tone in film, I wouldn't say it left completely, but it was different. We weren't seeing an onslaught of happy films, happy characters anymore. Things got a lot darker after 9/11. And I don't know if we've really necessarily even recovered from that darkness. Like, does that mean then we go a little bit darker? I hope not, like, because that would be a bit depressing. But in terms of, like, you talked about timing as well, like just giving room to breathe, giving a moment of that. I was looking at that one of the movies you were talking about, which was Remember Me, which is that Robert Pattinson movie. And the only, spoiler alert if you haven't seen it, but like the only reference it made to it was literally at the very, very end of the movie, when all of a sudden it turns out, hey, it's September 11th, and he happens to be in the World Trade Center. So we know what's going to happen now. That movie came out in 2010. So you're talking about nearly a decade afterwards. And that was considered still to be incredibly distasteful. And I think because it was it was using it to manipulate audiences into feeling something different for that character. So I don't, like, for that movie in particular, like not United 93 and World Trade, but that movie in particular, I think because it was clearly manipulating audiences, I think that's where people got very, very turned off by it. And I wonder if we're going to feel the same thing with COVID, where you don't want to get manipulated. You don't want it to all of a sudden be the twist in a movie that, oh, this was like a day before lockdown. Like, this is when all this started to happen, kind of thing. So, maybe that's the answer for it. And we've talked about recession movies as well from, 07, 08, that time period where people's lives were changed as well. A lot of people lost their jobs around that time, and people's mental health took a real beating as well. And, movies like Up in the Air came out. That was only in 09, and that was received very, very well. It was awarded quite heavily. I think it's got a high rating. Like it's a great movie. I really like that movie. And then you have movies like The Big Short that come out in 2015, which is many years later. And again, people really loved it because I think that was one that actually explained what happened during the recession, or gave people a bit of insight into it. So I don't know, maybe there is no one answer, and it's just your own preference. Do you think though we're going to see an onslaught of movies from directors and actors and writers that have to do with COVID?
I would not be shocked in the slightest. Like,
yeah,
if you were trying to predict what is going to happen in Hollywood, you know, the easiest, safest bet is what is the easiest story to tell, what is the most widely understood story that you can tell, all this sort of stuff. And like, and really, you know, we're comparing movies that were like, if you're talking about the recession, you're talking about movies made by Jason Reitman and Adam McKay, who, while Reitman I feel has fallen off significantly, are two very talented filmmakers. And then we're talking about some of these, you know, COVID films, and, you know, you've got one that is produced by Michael Bay, and I don't recognize Adam Mason, the director, if he's done anything else, who has a track record of not making very good films other than boom, boom, look at this sort of thing, versus, you know, Doug Liman, who did Locked Down. Well, he's got some misses in his career. Overall is a pretty decent director. And then Host, which was a very DIY project by people who actually cared about the craft of making a good horror film. You can start to see a pattern of, hey, talented, actually creative people will make good art, and hacks, for a lesser term, will not make good art, sort of thing. And, you know, I think, you know, much in the same way, like, I know Sacha Baron Cohen is a very talented artist and filmmaker and performer. I didn't really have an interest in watching a movie about the US election right before the US election. It's going to kind of be sort of similarly where you can, you know, if it was announced that, I don't know, Denis Villeneuve was making a COVID movie, I'd be highly skeptical. But I love Denis Villeneuve. He's like my favorite director right now. I'm like, well, I'm probably going to end up watching that. And I imagine if Denis Villeneuve wants to make a COVID set movie, it's probably going to be good, because he has a track record that suggests that he's going to hire good writers. He's going to be respectful for what he's trying to portray, all this sort of stuff, and it'll work out. So like, it really all depends on who is being greenlit and given money to make these sort of films.
What would you think about a Tarantino COVID film?
See, I love Tarantino, and, you know, he probably would, you know, a lot of his stuff is very, you know, I would not say it's horror, but like there's that adjacent aspect to it where he takes elements that, you know, go beyond the scope of what is considered normal and rational and reasonable, and all this sort of stuff, and puts on full display, usually in an exploitation style of manner. You know, if he was to do something like that, I feel like I would trust him to at least, you know, how do you go past the point of, you know, so you have Songbird, which is like, hey, we're gonna, you know, make everything way more unrealistic. Well, how do you go past that? What is the next point after that? And I feel like Tarantino would be someone that would like take that and then go to the next level beyond, of where it then becomes so absurd at the point of like, you understand what he is doing with it.
He likes his alternative, like, history, right? So, yeah. I mean, you look at like Inglourious Bastards, Once Upon a Time Hollywood. Yeah. He really likes that. So I wonder if he could come up. I mean, he has this whole thing of, I'm going to do 10 movies in my career, and he's done 9 now. So maybe the last one is the COVID movie that nobody really wants, but I think enough people would be very curious to watch it. I'd be in for a Denis Villeneuve COVID movie. I feel like I agree. I'm on with you. He's my favorite director working today. He hasn't made a bad movie yet. So I would be, I'd be very on board. But you're absolutely correct. It's about the filmmaker and what we think that they can bring to this topic. Because there are a ton of stories that, you know, potentially could be incredibly interesting that you could tell now. And you touched on this about how people just have this, you know, desire to be first, that everything, we have to have it straight away. There's no such thing as, you know, just wait a second, like, give me a second to process things. It's just an onslaught of media, an onslaught of information that we get these days. And I don't, maybe we're conditioned as an audience to take those in, but I look at, like there was the Netflix special that came out not too long ago, the Bo Burnham, Inside. Have you seen that one yet?
Not yet. It is very high on my watch list, though.
I like that for me is when I watched that, I thought it's a one-man show and it's him dealing with COVID, basically. The way that he's dealt with, from the lockdowns to, scare mental health issues, all of that. And when I saw that, I thought that's the kind of stuff that I would love to see come out of COVID. Like in terms of what types of stories we're going to tell. I would love to see more of those types of things. So just like, how did people deal with it? And do it in a way that is funny. Like there is some humor to it. And, but ultimately it's pretty, I don't know if heartwarming is the right word, but like for me, I felt very kind of happy and I don't know, optimistic-ish after I watched it. But I love that. Like I like the idea, like Host as well. I just think that's the type of creativity that I think is amazing to see to come out of such a dark time for the entire world. There's a ton of movies that have been made like around the world too. Like I know China has come out with quite a few different COVID related movies, and it'll be interesting to see. I'm not sure if I'm not sure. They definitely won't all be winners. But I think that there are some incredibly interesting stories to tell. And I'm curious to see what the current filmmakers, like the best ones that we have right now, see what they do with it. And see what the future filmmakers do of it. The ones that were, stuck away, the 20-year-olds, the teenagers, the ones that are going to be our next great filmmakers. I'd love to see what they're going to do with it as well. I would take a Chris Nolan, like time warp COVID movie. That would be fun. Like,
yeah,
Tenet 2 could be them dealing with COVID. That'd
even less understandable dialogue.
100%. Just a lot of noise and just a lot of talking backwards and sideways and frontwards and forward. Like, let's just do that. That'd be amazing. I really enjoyed it. I thought that this was a really interesting discussion. I'd love to hear from other people who are listening to like, what are your opinions about it? If there's something, your opinions on the movies that have come out about COVID, or where do you think that the film industry is going to go in terms of storytelling? I think it's an interesting topic and one that no one really knows the answer to, because who knows? Like only time is going to tell about this.
Yeah, I completely agree, and I think this is a great place to sort of wrap up this conversation. Rachel, where can people find you or your work online?
You can find me on Twitter. It's _RachelKH. You can also find me. I have a website, rachelkh.com. I do contribute to Exclaim a bit, so you can kind of go and look at some reviews and some features that I have there. It's exclaim.ca. And yeah, that's about it.
Yeah, and I'll make sure to link in the show notes the stuff that you did for In the Earth as well, so people can check that out for themselves as well. But make sure you follow the show on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at ContraZoomPod, and let us know your thoughts on the COVID set films and all the great stuff that Rachel was just mentioning there. Send an email to ContraZoomPod@gmail.com. Thank you to Eric and Kevin Smale for the theme music and to Stephanie Pryor for the logo design. If you could rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts, it will be a huge help for us to grow and find new listeners. Thanks for listening.